Hello and welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be back.
Ever wondered why some communities seem to just grow and reproduce naturally, almost like living things?
While others, even if they seem healthy, kind of stay put.
Exactly. They never quite seem to spread beyond that original group.
It's a really fascinating question, isn't it? And it's kind of at the heart of what drives expansion in communities of faith.
So today we're taking a deep dive into some source material focusing on exactly that. Church multiplication and indigenous CPM. CPM meaning church planting movements.
Yeah, we're going to unpack what this material tells us about that kind of rapid expansion.
Right. Our mission here is to take this specific document and really pull out the crucial insights for you. We want to understand the core concepts, maybe look at the history a bit,
See what the research shows.
and get to the practical dynamics discussed in this source. The goal is really just extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge for you about how and why some groups, reproduce exponentially.
And this source highlights something interesting. Unlike, say, plants or animals that reproduce naturally, for churches, multiplication often isn't automatic. It takes something more.
Something intentional.
Exactly. It requires a specific kind of internal DNA, you could say, and also a really deep connection to the environment they're actually in.
And that connection to the environment, that's key, right? The document uses a term that seems pretty central here, indigeneity.
Yes. Let's maybe start there.
Yeah.
This source defines church multiplication pretty simply, actually. It's about churches giving birth to other churches.
Okay. Simple enough.
But, like we said, it's not the default. It needs that intentionality built right into the process.
So what kind of intentionality are we talking about? What's this DNA you mentioned?
Well, the document talks about planting churches with multiplication potential right from the get-go.
Okay.
This means prioritizing organic values, thinking less like an organization building a static structure.
And more like a living thing, growing, dividing.
Precisely. It favors what it calls centrifugal growth, sending outwards over centripetal, which is more about pulling inwards, retaining.
Sending versus keeping.
Right. And crucially, it means using structures and methods that are easily reproducible by ordinary people in that context.
Okay, so that's the multiplication part, intentional, reproducible DNA. How does indigeneity fit into that picture?
Indigeneity, according to this source, is about churches that fit naturally into their local setting, their environment.
So they avoid just copying foreign patterns, like, say, Western patterns.
Exactly. The source puts it nicely. The missionary effort to establish indigenous churches is an effort to plant churches that fit naturally into their environment and to avoid planting churches that replicate Western patterns.
And these two concepts, multiplication and indigeneity, they're not just related in this material.
Oh, they're fundamentally linked. The document basically argues that indigeneity is critical. It says it's necessary, maybe not sufficient on its own, but necessary for multiplication to really happen.
So the idea is only churches that are truly indigenous, truly rooted in their own cultural soil, will genuinely reproduce and multiply, like a local plant versus an imported one.
That's the core idea, yeah. Intentionality and indigeneity are sort of the twin engines here.
Got it. So where does the source look for the origins of these ideas? Does it go way back?
It does. It suggests looking back to the New Testament patterns first, then tracing how these concepts developed over history, and finally examining modern principles and practices that seem to line up with multiplication.
Okay, so let's rewind. New Testament. The document points out something interesting. The term church planting movement isn't in the Bible.
Right. You won't find that specific phrase.
But the phenomenon absolutely is.
That's the argument. Early church growth wasn't some neat, systematic plan rolled out from headquarters. It was more like successive waves of expansion, often messy, pushing out into new places, new groups of people.
And you can sort of trace this outward movement in the book of Acts, can't you?
Definitely. It starts with that movement centered in Judea, right after Pentecost, Acts 2 through 7.
Then you get Acts 8, where persecution actually triggers a dispersion. Believers scatter.
And they go back home to places like Samaria, Galilee, Syria.
And they take the message with them.
And here's where it gets interesting, right? The church in Syrian Antioch, which becomes this huge hub for reaching non-Jews.
Yeah, a major center.
It actually comes out of that scattering of ordinary believers, not primarily from the apostles setting up a new branch office, so to speak.
That's a key point in the source. It emerged somewhat organically from the dispersion.
And then from Antioch, starting around Acts 13, you see these more deliberate waves of missionary activity pushing the boundaries further.
Paul's approach is highlighted here as really significant. He established new churches in key cities, centers of influence. But critically, the source argues, they were indigenous churches from the start.
Meaning what in practice? Meaning he didn't stay long-term to pastor them. He itinerated. He equipped local believers to carry the message forward in their own way, in their own context, and then he moved on.
And the source points to the impact. Acts 13.49, Pisidian Antioch. The word of the Lord spread through the whole region.
Not just the city, the whole region.
Ephesus, Acts 19.10. All the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord.
The whole province.
And Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians 1.8. The Lord's message rang out from you. Your faith in God has become known everywhere.
That sounds like more than just isolated churches.
It sounds like saturation, yeah. And a really vital observation the document makes is the role of ordinary believers in all this.
Not just the apostles.
Not just the apostles or the designated missionaries. The widespread expansion seems to have come primarily through the witness of lay believers, just regular folks, as they moved around, did business, lived their lives.
The source calls great movements Jesus movements.
Yeah, lay-driven, focused simply on who Jesus is and what he did, and just naturally evangelistic because of that. Okay, what about indigeneity back then? The term wasn't used, like you said, but how is the concept present?
Well, the source argues it was present in how the early churches engaged with the cultures around them.
How so?
It was both contextually relevant, speaking to people in ways they understood, but also counterculturally biblical. They didn't just blend in completely if it meant compromising core beliefs or ethics.
And the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is a big example of this.
A huge example. The source calls it the Emancipation Proclamation of the Church.
Strong words. Why?
Because it theologically freed Gentile, non-Jewish churches from having to adopt Jewish cultural practices like circumcision or dietary laws to be considered fully Christian.
Ah, okay. That decision was pivotal, though.
Absolutely. It allowed the church to develop forms of expression, worship, community life that were culturally appropriate for Greeks, Romans, others, as long as they stayed consistent with biblical morality.
So it let churches be rooted locally without being bound by another culture's traditions, and was leadership local, too, right from the start.
Yes, absolutely key. Paul's pattern, as the source highlights, was to quickly place these new congregations under the guidance of local elders, indigenous leaders.
And then he'd move on.
His team would move on, entrusting the churches to God and their own local leaders. So these early churches were indigenous because they were led by locals, often unpaid lay elders, meeting in homes supported by local means, rooted in their own soil.
So the seeds of this intentional, indigenous, reproducible kind of movement were planted right there in the New Testament.
That's the argument. And the study of these principles didn't stop there, of course. It's not a new idea. The source traces it forward.
Right. It mentions figures like Rufus Anderson and Henry Venn in the 19th century.
Yeah, key figures in mission thinking back then.
They're linked with the famous 3-self formula, aren't they?
That's them. Self-propagating, self-governing, and self-supporting.
So reproduce themselves, make their own decisions, pay their own bills.
Exactly. For quite a while, that became the stated goal for a lot of Protestant church planting, aiming for churches that could stand on their own feet. Though the source does note this formula, while a good step, often had limitations in how it was actually applied.
Then we get to John L. Nevius, Presbyterian missionary, work in China. He seemed to really dig into these practices.
Yes, he developed what became known as the Nevius Plan, based on what he saw actually working, or maybe not working. It had 3 core elements.
Okay, what were they?
First, he insisted churches should be entirely self-supporting from the start, and crucially, led by unpaid national lay workers.
Unpaid? Why?
He found that paying young believers to do mission work often backfired. It created dependency, it professionalized something that he felt should be voluntary, and it actually hindered the natural, spontaneous spread of the faith by ordinary people.
Huh. That's really counterintuitive, isn't it?
What else? Second, use only methods and resources that local believers could actually take full responsibility for themselves.
Like what?
Like building native-style places to meet using local materials, not imported blueprints and funds, and having local leaders selected and supported by their own communities, not appointed or paid from outside.
Makes sense. And the third element?
Third, believers needed careful, thorough instruction, primarily through Bible classes. Grounding them deeply in Scripture was central. Converts were trained right in their natural environment, learning how to live out their faith where they were, not pulled out into a separate institution initially.
And this approach, the Nivi's plan, it had a big impact somewhere specific.
The source uses Korea as a prime example. Young Presbyterian missionaries adopted Nivius's approach there, starting around 1890. It was intentionally self-propagating, self-supporting, self-governing right from the beginning.
And the results.
Pretty dramatic growth. The source quotes figures from one church with about 93 members in 1890 to 153 churches with 8,500 members just 4 years later.
Wow, that's rapid multiplication. And they contrast this with Methodist work in Korea at the same time.
Right. The Methodists also saw conversions, definitely. But researchers later, like Alfred Wasson mentioned in the source, noted their growth tended to level off compared to the Presbyterians.
And the reason?
Wasson attributed the difference not to fewer conversions initially, but to things like higher attrition rates and slower multiplication in the Methodist churches, because, he argued, they didn't consistently follow these indigenous principles. It wasn't just about getting people in the door, it was about how the church was planted and structured for ongoing, locally driven life and reproduction.
That really highlights how the method itself matters for long-term growth and multiplication. Another key figure the source brings up is Roland Allen.
Ah, yes, Roland Allen.
Mm.
Missionary, worked in China and Africa early 20th century. He became a really influential, maybe even prophetic, critic of mission practices of his day.
Through his books.
Yeah, books like Missionary Methods, St. Paul's, or Ours, and The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church. He argued forcefully for a return to what he saw as Paul's principles. He felt churches weren't reproducing because they weren't being allowed to, quote, spring up in the soil from the very first seeds planted.
He sounds like he was pretty critical of missionary control in Western ways.
Very critical. Allen urged missionaries to basically abandon Western institutions, this idea of needing to civilize converts first, relying on outside money, and any kind of, condescending attitude.
So what should they do?
He believed they needed to entrust local believers fully to the guidance and power of the Holy Spirit, free them from missionary control, allow that spiritual dynamic seen in Acts to actually flourish.
So the missionary's role changes completely.
Dramatically. It becomes more like a counseling elder brother, offering guidance, support, maybe wisdom, but letting the Holy Spirit lead the new church, which is self-governing and self-supporting, to develop its own forms, its own ways of being church.
And Allen argued that only that kind of truly indigenous church could become, what was the phrase?
Spontaneously missionary. Naturally driven to spread the gospel itself because it was their church, their faith, rooted in their context. Without those characteristics, he argued, a movement would just stay dependent and never achieve real multiplication.
That sounds like a powerful message. Was it picked up right away?
The source notes that while Allen's ideas got praise, they weren't widely put into practice by most mission groups until after World War II. The old models were just very ingrained, slow to change.
Okay, so let's fast forward then. The 20th century. The document calls it the growth century, especially in places like Africa, Asia, Latin America. This led to more focused study, right?
Exactly. Missiologists started empirically studying these rapid growth situations, trying to figure out why it was happening in some places and not others.
And this is where Donald McGavran and the Church Growth Movement, or CGM, come in.
Right. McGavran really pioneered using tools from social and behavioral sciences to research the causes of church growth. His movement produced hundreds of studies.
And he's associated with some principles that stirred things up a bit, sometimes controversial.
Yes, definitely generated discussion. One core principle was the importance of people movements.
What's that?
It's observing that often new believers stay within their existing social networks, family, friends, clans. They become, as McGavran put it, God's bridges into those networks. Groups often decide together rather than just isolated individuals converting.
Why is that significant?
It avoids the social dislocation that can happen when someone converts alone and gets cut off from their community. McGavran claimed, maybe controversially, that up to 90% of growth in what he called younger churches came through this kind of dynamic, keeping social ties intact.
Okay. Then there was the harvest principle.
This was basically the idea of focusing missionary effort on populations that seem receptive, those who are ripe for harvest, so to speak.
A pragmatic approach.
Yeah, pretty pragmatic, suggesting you direct resources where the response seems highest to maximize growth. Not necessarily ignoring other groups, but prioritizing receptive ones.
And then the one that really sparked debate, the homogeneous unit principle, or HUP.
Right. McGavran observed, quote, Men like to become Christians without crossing racial, linguistic, or class barriers. So the HUP suggested planting churches of people who are already alike in those ways,
The goal being.
to remove social barriers, arguing that the gospel itself should be the only obstacle people face. Don't make them cross cultural or class lines at the same time they're considering faith.
And that one definitely caused pushback.
Oh, yeah. Critics found it may be overly pragmatic, potentially prioritizing numbers over deeper theological concerns about unity across social lines, or even potentially reinforcing existing social divisions rather than challenging them. Some called it theologically shallow or methodologically reductionistic.
So while McGavin was observing real phenomena, how people often come to faith.
The strategic application, the HUP, was where the controversy lay.
So what's the takeaway from CGM in this source?
The source suggests that many of McGavran's observations are helpful, but they need to be seen in that broader light we discussed. Churches must be indigenous, spirit-led, self-supporting to achieve lasting multiplication. That wasn't always the primary focus of CGM itself, which sometimes focused more on the how-to of growth.
Okay. More recently, then, 21st century, the focus shifted specifically to church planting movements, CPMs. David Garrison's work is mentioned.
Yes, Garrison's research brought renewed focus. He defined a CPM as a rapid and exponential increase of indigenous churches planting churches within a given people group or population segment. He looked for common factors across these movements.
And the document lists his 10 common elements found in CPMs. Let's see. Extraordinary prayer.
Abundant evangelism.
Intentional planting of reproducing churches.
The authority of God's word.
Local leadership.
Lay leadership.
House churches.
Churches planting churches.
Rapid reproduction.
And healthy churches.
That's quite a list. Is it like a recipe? Follow these 10 steps?
Not exactly. The source presents them more as indicators, maybe fingerprints, of vitality, things that tend to be present when this rapid indigenous multiplication is happening.
So they help movements stay grounded, transcend barriers?
Yeah, benchmarks for assessment, maybe highlighting areas where synergy is strong or perhaps where things are weak.
But it's still not a simple formula you can just plug and play?
Absolutely not. The source stresses context matters hugely. Reproduction won't look the same everywhere, the rate varies, and there are loads of external factors at play.
Factors the church planter doesn't control.
Right, things like the spiritual landscape, societal attitudes, the political climate.
What kind of external factors seem to correlate with CPMs, according to this source?
Well, it notes they seem more frequent in collectivistic societies compared to highly individualistic or secular ones. McGavran's finding about the masses, not the classes, the poor, working class often being more responsive, gets mentioned.
Interesting. What else?
They often emerge during times of significant social change, upheaval, even persecution, maybe more so than in times of peace and stability.
And the existing religious backdrop.
That matters too. Often where folk religions or less structured religious environments are common, maybe because forms emerging from the local culture feel more natural there. The relationship with traditional religious establishments is also significant, and marginalized groups might be more receptive.
So for someone working in a place that isn't seeing rapid growth, maybe a very secular, stable context, what's the takeaway from this document? Just give up.
No, not at all. The advice seems to be patience and faithfulness. Pray deeply. Keep sowing the gospel. Focus on making strong disciples using indigenous principles, even if growth is slow.
And crucially,
Resist the pressure to shift too quickly into just being a pastor, a caretaker, or the main doer of ministry, because that can actually hinder multiplication long-term by setting precedents of dependence.
the source mentions Quebec during the Quiet Revolution as an example.
Yeah, an interesting case. Between roughly 1975 and 1985, as Quebec society went through rapid secularization, leaving a kind of spiritual vacuum, evangelical churches apparently more than tripled.
Where was the growth strongest?
Especially in rural areas where people were maybe disillusioned with traditional religion. Folks who had been patiently sowing the gospel, using, presumably, more indigenous approaches, saw a significant harvest during that window of change. The landscape shifted again later, but it shows how external factors and faithful indigenous work can intersect.
Okay, so we've looked at history research. Let's get really practical. What does this document say about the actual practices that seem to advance multiplication?
Right, the best practices. But again, the source is careful. These aren't a magic formula. They depend on the context, and ultimately, the results are up to God.
Garrison's 10 commandments, based on his elements, get mentioned here as consistent principles.
Yeah, things like immerse everything in prayer, Saturate the area with the gospel message. Cling to God's word as the authority. Actively fight foreign dependency. Eliminate elements that can't be easily reproduced by locals.
Live the vision of reproduction yourself.
Build it into every believer in church. Train all believers for ministry. Adopt that model, assist, watch, leave approach.
And always try to discover what God is already doing and join in.
Those are seen as sort of active guiding principles for people involved in trying to catalyze a movement.
But the document brings up a really important tension, doesn't it? Balancing rapid reproduction with healthy multiplication. Speed isn't everything.
Exactly. This is key. Rapid growth can be exciting, it can communicate urgency, but it doesn't automatically mean that churches are healthy or the fruit will last.
So sometimes slower is better.
Sometimes, starting with slower, more deliberate methods might build a stronger foundation that actually leads to faster, healthier, more sustainable growth down the road. The source points out the Bible often emphasizes abundant fruit, like in John 15 or Jesus' parables about growth in Mark 4 and Matthew 13, rather than just speed for speed's sake.
It mentions Orlando Custis talking about balanced growth.
Yeah, the idea that healthy growth has breadth reaching many people, but also depth, solid discipleship, understanding, and height becoming a visible, transforming community.
So the responsibility isn't just speed, it's faithfulness.
Right. Plant wisely, biblically, apply these kinds of best practices faithfully, and then trust God with the speed and the scale of what happens.
Okay, let's dive into some of those specific practices, the source details. First one, adopting an apostolic approach. What does that mean?
It means the initial planters, especially cross-cultural ones, don't stay to become the long-term pastor. Their role is different.
Like Paul.
Like Paul. Lay the foundation. Intentionally equip and empower local believers and leaders, making sure the methods are reproducible. And then move on to pioneer new areas.
But they might come back.
Oh yeah, return periodically to encourage, strengthen, troubleshoot. But the primary role shifts from being the main caregiver or doer to being an equipper, a catalyst. In dense areas, one planter might even juggle multiple projects at different stages.
Okay. Second practice, develop, empower, and release local workers.
This is huge. It's about identifying potential leaders and workers right there in the harvest field, sometimes called persons of peace in the literature.
And investing in them.
Investing heavily in them. They are the natural bridges into the culture. They'll be much more effective long term. The source uses an analogy. The cross-cultural team is like scaffolding.
Temporary support.
But the emerging national leaders are the pillars, the permanent structure. A rule of thumb mentioned is don't even start planting somewhere new unless you've identified local apprentices to pour into who can eventually take over.
Like Paul recruiting Timothy or Apollos from the harvest itself.
Exactly that model.
Third practice, maintain an ongoing emphasis on evangelism and discipleship. It seems basic, but...
But the source argues it's foundational and often gets lost. Disciple-making has to remain the core focus. Not just getting decisions, but leading people to Christ, and then intentionally teaching them how to live with Christ, follow Him, obey Him, in community.
And this is easily neglected.
Very easily, especially when groups shift into a more pastoral mode, focused on caring for existing members. The source links success or failure in multiplication directly to how fruitful a group is at making new disciples, who then make other disciples. Movements plateau when they lose that outward evangelistic edge and become internally focused.
Okay. Fourth, build multiplication into every level. What does that mean?
It means reproduction isn't just an event, like planting a new church sometimes. It needs to be in the DNA of everything. Individual disciples should be equipped and expected to share their faith. Evangelism should be imitable. Disciples are discipled in order to disciple others. Small groups or cells should be led in a way that apprentice leaders naturally emerge.
Like 10 Timothy 2.2, teaching faithful people who can teach others also.
Exactly. So the group can naturally divide and multiply. And church multiplication happens organically when this DNA is present from the start, not just by occasionally hiving off some members to start something new. It has to be built in.
Making reproduction the default, not the exception.
Pretty much. Fifth practice, model ministry that can be reproduced by local people using local resources. This sounds critical.
Reproducibility seems to be the watchword here.
It absolutely is. The methods used by the initial planters, especially outsiders, must be easily replicable by local believers using resources readily available to them.
So no dependence on expensive tech or big budget.
Ideally, no. If the core methods require computers, vehicles, large budgets that locals don't have access to, the movement will just stall as soon as the outside resources dry up. or it never gets started by locals in the first place.
So building on local skills is vital too.
Critically important. If it's an oral culture, use oral methods like storytelling, drama, songs. Don't impose literate methods they can't easily use or pass on. Standards should fit local capabilities, not necessarily Western ones. Keep skill requirements low, but spiritual standards high.
The methods need to be easy to teach, catch, and pass on.
That's the goal. The source has a sharp rule of thumb. If you can't teach local leaders to do it, and they can't teach others, you probably shouldn't either.
Ouch, that's challenging.
It is, because true multiplication isn't when the outsider teaches locals. It's when locals are teaching the next generation of locals. There's a place for formal training for some, but the core training for the majority needs to be reproducible on the ground. And avoid using unsustainable methods even just to jumpstart things, unless you have a clear plan to phase them out quickly.
Okay. And the last practice mentioned. Choose contextually appropriate church structures.
Right. Don't force foreign structures onto a local culture. The source uses the image of David trying to fight in Saul's armor. It just doesn't fit. It hinders him.
So imported church models often don't thrive.
Or reproduce naturally, yeah. The source stresses the Bible allows for a lot of flexibility in how church looks, as long as it's fulfilling biblical purposes and embodying biblical values.
So who decides the structure?
Ideally, the local believers themselves, guided by the Spirit and the Word, should discover the forms that work best for evangelism, discipleship, meetings, worship, leadership in their specific context. Outsiders can counsel, offer wisdom, share options.
But not dictate the blueprint.
Exactly. Let it emerge organically.
Okay, so we've seen the principles, the practices that seem to advance multiplication. What about the flip side? What actively stops it? What are the big deterrents this document flags?
Yeah, the source is pretty direct here. It says, movement expansion needs spirit-led local people operating without unnecessary shackles. And it identifies 3 major stumbling blocks, often stemming from well-meaning but ultimately harmful expectations, especially ones imported from the West.
What's the first deterrent?
Expensive church meeting places.
Buildings.
Yeah. CPMs typically meet in homes, maybe small rented storefronts, simple, inexpensive structures. Churches that get burdened with heavy rents, mortgages, or massive building projects often become very reluctant to send out members to start new groups.
Because they need the people and the money to maintain the building.
Exactly. Building projects can drain huge amounts of energy and resources. They can become status symbols, distractions from the main mission. You lose flexibility when you're tied to long-term leases or property ownership. And the very idea that a real church needs its own expensive building slows multiplication down to the speed of fundraising, which is almost never exponential.
Okay, that makes sense. Deterrent number 2.
Making church planting dependent on formally educated, paid church planters.
Yeah. This one is flagged as maybe the biggest obstacle.
Arguably, yes, for several reasons. First, globally, there's simply never going to be enough money to pay all the workers needed for a widespread movement. Second, formal theological education, while valuable, takes years. You can't graduate enough people fast enough to keep pace with rapid growth.
And it sends a message.
It creates the impression, often unintentionally, that ordinary, untrained laypeople aren't qualified or capable of leading a church or starting a new one. The Western history of a professionalized clergy can really hinder these more organic grassroots movements.
So what's the alternative highlighted?
CPMs rely heavily on bivocational leaders, people with regular jobs, lay leaders, local planters. Their training happens through informal, non-formal means, modeling, mentoring, on-the-job training, maybe short-term church-based workshops.
What's the focus of that training?
Intense focus on biblical understanding, character formation, and practical ministry skills needed right then and there. These lay-led churches might start small, yes, but if they have the DNA to reproduce, the movement grows.
So it's not anti-education, but
don't make the expansion dependent on formal credentials. You absolutely need highly educated leaders for theological depth, for training trainers later on. But don't bottleneck the initial spread by requiring them for every new group. The examples given are telling Colombian lay missionaries who are self-supporting, and the massive growth of the Mekane Yesus Church in Ethiopia, largely driven by voluntary lay ministries, lay ministry churches.
Garrison's line fits here in these movements. No passengers, everyone is crew.
Exactly. Everyone is empowered, expected to contribute, to lead at some level.
Okay, and the third major deterrent?
Dependence on outside resources.
Money again.
Money, but also personnel support from outside. Equipment. Buildings funded from abroad. The source stresses using extreme caution here. while outside help can sometimes provide a needed boost.
There's a big but.
A huge but. It can easily set precedents that are non-reproducible and unsustainable locally.
The document gives that example about Steve Saint and the Waodani people in Ecuador.
Yeah, it's a really poignant story. Foreigners helped them build a better, more permanent meeting house using cement blocks and stuff. The result, the Waodani stopped building their traditional reproducible bamboo meeting houses.
Why?
They concluded that only foreigners knew how to build proper god houses. It inadvertently killed their own indigenous building practices and created dependence for that aspect of church life.
Wow. That's a powerful illustration of unintended consequences.
It really is. And the source explains how this dependency hinders multiplication in three main ways. First, outside resources are always limited. They will eventually end. If the planting strategy relies on them, the multiplication stops when the money stops. Real multiplication needs local resources. Second, it creates the impression, as we saw with Waodani, that planting is impossible without external sponsors. Local believers then excuse themselves, we can't do that, we don't have outside funding. Third, it often leads to what's called a patron-client relationship. The mission built it, so the mission needs to maintain it. The local group doesn't feel true ownership or responsibility. They might not even be able to pay the light bill on a building someone else gave them, let alone think about reproducing it elsewhere. It rarely leads to genuine, sustainable multiplication rooted in local ownership.
So avoiding those deterrents, expensive buildings, dependence on paid outsiders, dependence on foreign money seems absolutely crucial for fostering that indigenous reproducible DNA.
That's the strong argument made in this source material, yes.
Okay, so weaving all this together, the principles, the practices, avoiding the deterrents, how does the document describe this actually playing out over time, this from generation to generation idea?
It outlines it as kind of a natural progression of ownership and leadership transfer.
So first generation.
In the first generation, you often have the initial planters, maybe cross-cultural workers, who are modeling the vision, the methods, the DNA, for local apprentices they've identified and are starting to develop.
Okay, they're showing the way. Second generation.
Now, those initial planters are working alongside the first generation of local leaders. But increasingly, those local leaders are the ones taking the lead in planting new churches, discipling new believers. The outsiders are stepping back a bit.
Third generation.
By this point, the new leaders who are emerging are learning primarily from their local peers, from the second-generation leaders. They're using methods and approaches that are already naturally contextualized. The cross-cultural workers, if still around, are much more in the background, observing, advising only when asked, maybe.
And the fourth generation.
This is seen as the point where the outside influence is minimal or gone entirely. The leadership is fully local. The multiplication DNA is firmly embedded. Reproduction is just part of how things work. Because the leaders, the methods, the resources, the systems are all homegrown, the movement at this stage is considered truly, deeply indigenous.
It sounds like a very dynamic process of letting go and rooting down.
It is. And the source is rightly humble about it, acknowledging that, the final word has not been written on fully understanding these complex movements. Research is ongoing, context matters immensely, it's not neat and tidy.
But the core themes seem consistent throughout this material. Intentionality, indigeneity, building in that reproductive DNA from the start, and actively avoiding dependencies that stifle local ownership and initiative. Those seem vital.
Absolutely. Those are the threads running through the whole discussion. The document suggests these principles and practices, when applied with wisdom, prayer, cultural sensitivity, offer a potential pathway towards multiplication in many different kinds of contexts.
Well, this deep dive into the source material has certainly given us, and hopefully you, a much clearer picture of the dynamics involved in how movements grow, spread, and get deeply rooted in their own environment, moving beyond just adding numbers to achieving that genuine multi-generational multiplication.
And it does leave us with a pretty thought-provoking idea at the end, doesn't it? The source focuses entirely on these principles within communities of faith, arguing they're key to organic, reproducible growth there.
Right. But what might it look like if you took these core ideas, organic growth, reproducibility, contextual rootedness, trusting local resources, empowering ordinary people, avoiding harmful dependencies, and thought about applying them in other areas, other kinds of communities or initiatives you encounter?
Yeah, what would that look like? Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.